This is a reminder of another Sufi story. But as has been said, these stories have an essence, what you could call a secret essence. But like all stories, they can be understood and interpreted by the mind on its three levels. That nitty-gritty or linear level where time and learning, lessons and teachers abide. In that occult level of miracles and magic and grace. And on that level of interrelatedness or subjectivity. But because the Sufi stories have this deep and secret kernel, we have the possibility and the challenge of being in the state where this secret essence is revealed to us. If we can be in that state where the stories' secret essence is revealed, we can do so in the moments of life. The story is about that king who, at the very tender age of 18, ascended to the throne. But his father, the late king, had left him 3 wise viziers, and he himself had chosen a 4th who was more close to his own age. So with these 4 viziers he resided over a kingdom that was abundant and prosperous and peaceful. In fact, all was well in the king's world, his domain, except for one thing. He had married a beautiful princess who he adored with all his heart, but they were without an heir. They'd called on physicians and magicians and conjurers and sorcerers, but to no avail. They had not produced a child. The wife, who loved him very dearly, pleaded with him, "Oh, take concubines, go with other women, maybe they can produce a son for you." But none of the women, even though he reluctantly did so, produced a child. So they decided that the only recourse they had was to find the prophet Kadir. Now it was known by all that Kadir abides in the occult realms and only comes down when a miracle is needed. So where to find Kadir? How could he be called when it wasn't possible to invoke him? But, as was the custom in those times, the way of broadcasting abroad was to send out messengers. So the king sent out messages throughout all of the lands. Anyone who could produce the prophet Kadir would be rewarded with 1,000 gold sovereigns. But of course, no one could produce the great prophet Kadir. It was not known that he could be invoked in any way. But it so happened that there was an old camelteer. He lived with his wife in a ramshackle shack on the edge of a village outside the king's kingdom. And it came to his ears that this 1,000 gold sovereigns was to be rewarded to anyone who could produce Kadir. Now, he didn't know how he could do it, but as it happened, he made his livelihood with his old camel, using the camel to carry goods for people between the villages. But his camel was old as he was, and he was tired of the slavery, all that was required to keep even a minimum of food on their table. So he had a plan. He would go to the king and tell him that he could produce Kadir, but he would ask that he be given 1,000 sovereigns in advance. So at very least his wife could be taken care of. So this he did. He presented himself at the palace. But of course, the attendants and the courtiers and the guards were reluctant to let him in, because after all, he was just a camelteer. But he came into the king's presence, and the king, even though he thought he was rather a disreputable character, was desperate. So he decided that he would listen. And so the camelteer said, "Yes, I can produce the Kadir, but I would like to have the 1,000 sovereigns in advance." Well, the king said, "You realize that if you cannot fulfill this promise, you will have to return the 1,000 sovereigns and you will lose your head." But the camelteer agreed with this, and so the 1,000 sovereigns were given, and he returned to his home, and immediately he made life comfortable for his dear wife. He repaired the windows and the roof that was leaking, and they ate as they had never eaten before, the food of their choice, choices that were beyond their realms of possibilities in their state of poverty. But even though with this wealth, they did not forget to think of others, and they invited the villagers to share their abundance, putting on feasts for those who needed food. And so the days passed, and because 40 days were given, and the days crept on, and of course the muleteer had no possibility of calling on Kadir. But he still gave alms, he took care of his wife, he put aside some of the sovereigns for her well-being, knowing that he was to lose his head. But then, on the evening of the 39th day, after they had given a great feast for their neighbors, at midnight there was a knock on the door. Who could it be, they thought? Was it one of their friends who had left something behind? Who could be calling at this time? So they answered the door, and outside the door was an old dervish. And the dervish said, "I am a traveler and fatigued, and it's coming to night time. Could you give me hospitality for the night?" And he was welcomed in and given the remnants of the feast that had been given that evening, which he ate with relish. And then he asked, could he stay the night? And they readily agreed and were about to make a bed for him, but he refused, just lying down on the hearth beside the fire, wrapping his patchwork cloak around him, and was soon fast asleep. But not the old camoteer and his wife. They spent the night in each other's arms, commiserating, knowing that the very next day that he would lose his head. So they cried and cried together. And sure enough, the next morning, a harsh knock on the door, and the sound of the soldiers who were all too ready to take the camoteer with force if they needed to. But quivering and shaking, the camoteer said, "I'm ready to go with you." But then the dervish spoke up, and he said, "I wish to come with you. I have something to say to the king." And of course, the soldiers, seeing the dervish and knowing their gentleness and judging him to be harmless, allowed him to come along. So the camoteer was brought into the presence of the king, who said, "Well, have you produced Kadir?" "No," said the camoteer, "I was not able to do so." Well, the king said, "Return the 1,000 gold sovereigns, and know that you must now lose your head." The camoteer said, "I cannot return the gold. It has already been spent." And the king said, "Well, now you must lose your head." But he had his viziers, 2 on one side of him and 2 on the other. And he turned to the first vizier and he said, "What punishment should be meted to this man?" And the first vizier said, "He should be chopped limb from limb, and his limbs and his torso hung on hooks for everyone to see that they cannot defraud our king." And then the dervish, who was standing in the background, spoke up and said, "It all depends on the origin." But nobody listened to him. In fact, nobody seemed to hear him. But then the king turned to the second vizier and said, "How should he be punished?" And the second vizier said, "He should be thrown in the fire at the communal baths as a lesson to everyone." And again the vizier spoke up, the dervish spoke up and said, "It all depends on the origins." But again no one took note of what he said. And then the king turned to the third vizier, and the third vizier said, "He should be skewered with a great needle and allowed to bleed to death in front of everyone, so that everyone will know again not to defraud our king." Again, this time a little more stridently, the dervish spoke up and said, "It all depends on the origin." Then the king turned to the fourth vizier, the youngest, and he said, "What punishment would you give And the young vizier said, "Sire, you come from a long line of kings who are known for their magnanimous nature, for their compassion for their subjects. And indeed, if you do show compassion and pity for this old man, surely you will reap your rewards in lives to come." Again, but this time stepping forward, the dervish said, "It all depends on the origin." And then the king had to decide which of his viziers he would follow. But then he was inspired, and he turned to the dervish and he said, "Tell me, what do you mean by 'it depends on the origins'?" And the dervish spoke up and said, "If you will allow me to speak without any thought of being punished." And the king agreed. So the old dervish said, your first vizier is the son of a butcher. So his advice to you was accordance with what he had learned. He had seen his father dismember sheep and hang their pieces on hooks. So this is why he gave this punishment. Your second vizier is the son of he who shovels the wood into the communal bath furnace to heat the water. So he has given you advice according to his heritage. Your third vizier is the son of a saddle maker, and he often saw his father taking his huge needle to sew the leather which made those saddles, and has answered in accordance with his heritage. Your fourth vizier is the son of a great noble, of noble lineage, known for his largesse, his compassion for mankind, and his gentle nature. So he has answered in accordance with his heritage. The king was surprised. He challenged the dervish. How do you know of my vizier's heritage? Because it has been kept a secret all along, their humble beginnings hidden, so that they could be seen only as wise. But to the great surprise of everyone, instead of answering the question, poof, the dervish disappeared before everyone's eyes. Instantly, the king and all those who were present recognized that this dervish must have been none other than Kadir himself. The king immediately released the camelteer from his obligations. gave to him a pension which allowed him to live comfortably for the remainder of his days with his beloved wife. A miracle. That evening, the king embraced his own beautiful and much loved queen. And 9 months later, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, and everyone knew that a miracle, blessing, grace had been given, and that the prince would grow into a worthy successor, and the princess into a gentle and gracious queen. We can readily interpret and understand this story on each of those 3 levels of mind. But what is its secret? What is it that's contained in every single story, every single experience, every single encounter, every single being? What is the secret essence of this story? Or what is it that comes up to your mind? Whatever it is can lead us to that through whatever expression, as is the stories, their essence is revealed, or in those things that you speak and do and breathe, that essence is given. But first, the stories. What arises to your mind? Which would be the doorway to your knowing what the secret of all things is.
Love.
Yes. On all those 3 levels, in one form or another. And what's behind that love? What is that secret that you hold? But if we have that, we have the doorway. We have the doorway. If we can recognize that. So what is it for you?
For me, that story was that that in this life as a human, we're a reflection of what we've experienced in that human form. That's what we are.
Yes.
On this level.
Right. Yes.
But we basically, we tend to look at people and expect certain things and judge in certain ways, but everybody is a reflection.
Yes. These 3 levels that go together, that linear, which is our heritage, our genealogy, those things that condition us in this life and have conditioned us in others, that time, cause and effect, objectivity, and our intuition and the magic, our dreams, and that level that we all have of subjectivity, relatedness. Can you separate them in your life now? Where is the line between them now? Time, magic, and timelessness. Can you make a dividing line between them? I venture to say no. Which allows us to confirm that we are integrated. We have got our body, mind and spirit merged to allow us to live in what we call that state of Satchitananda, existence, knowledge and bliss. One word, not three. So it's only natural that we must then embrace all of those in that essence that's in these stories. Where do the elements of this story meet? Where do the levels of understanding of this story come together? In us. This is the secret. We can readily embrace all three levels of mind. But what is it that embraces mind? Catch the secret in this story and see for yourself.
None of them is able to produce the answer for their
No?
problem, wherever they are.
No.
Whether the king or the camel or the other one, the wise.
Yes.
They have to open up to something greater.
Yes, greater. Yes.
They can
No. No. No.
And without love and compassion, there's no transformation.
None at all.
You're stuck. Everything that comes from the past.
That's right.